Hello, I'm James Binns and I'm specialising in concept art. I chose the brief for cultural heritage, and the reason for choosing this brief was because I myself enjoy visiting museums and galleries and have an interest in art from different periods of time. I recently visited the Louvre and queued up to see the Mona Lisa, which I was able to look at for all of about 10 seconds and from a distance. This brought about my first initial idea of recreating the Mona Lisa in VR for people to get up close to, touch, and enjoy all for themselves. This did not fit the brief, however, so the project manifested into a VR experience showcasing a few of Da Vinci's most famous works. I am aiming to create a small interactive gallery space so that players can get really close up to and examine some of Da Vinci's most famous pieces. This gallery will allow the user to not only get up close and personal with each painting, but allow them to change the scale of the pieces in order to look at the finer details. It will also include an explode feature, so the user can look at how the frames were pieced together with the artwork inside. This will showcase everything from each side of the frame, to the backboard, and to the biscuits holding them together. I designed this 3D mock-up to showcase how the player would interact with their surroundings, particularly focusing on making the space feel like a gallery. I integrated high ceilings and a large floor space to ensure the player does not feel claustrophobic. Also, the frames are strategically placed so you can see them as you enter through the door, and a figure is placed to show that they are all at eye level as you approach. This video shows an animation of how the frames would explode in VR, enabling the viewer to see the individual pieces that make up the design of the frame. The user would then be able to grab the individual pieces in order to inspect them further. This allows people to gain an understanding of how frames are displayed and contracted in a way that would not usually be possible in a gallery setting. Here we will take a look at each frame both in original and exploded form. This is frame 1, Salvator Mundi, created in 1500. This depicts an image of Jesus in Renaissance dress. Frame 2, named Lady with an Ermine, created in 1489 to 1490, depicting Cecilia Gallerani, the mistress of the Duke of Milan at the time. Frame 3, the Mona Lisa, created in 1503 and probably Da Vinci's most famous piece, depicting an unknown subject. And frame 4, St. John the Baptist, depicting St. John the Baptist in isolation. This was believed to be Da Vinci's final painting. Here are some close-ups of the final frame renders. These images were all rendered in Marmoset Toolbag 3. These shots show how the player could interact with the frames in VR. The player can explode the frames and take a look at each piece it is made up of individually, whilst also being able to look closely at the paintings themselves. My first task was to collate research into my intended project. I began to put together a mood board consisting of some of Da Vinci's most famous pieces and the frames that they were encased in. This would keep them authentic. It became increasingly apparent that certain frames could not be copied exactly due to the complexity of them, and these would have to be sculpted in ZBrush because normal maps can often look fake in a VR scene. This led me to turn my attention to aged frames that had ornate patterns in the texture, so I could make them look authentic at a lower poly count. Creating a plan for the project would allow me to keep track of my goals in order to make sure I was using my time efficiently and staying on track with weekly tasks. Week 1 consisted of creating the frames using 3ds Max using the reference collated on my mood board. Week 2. This week I began researching unwrapping using Blender and focused on teaching myself this process whilst also trying to get all 4 frames unwrapped and ready to texture. Week 3 and 4. These 2 weeks were dedicated to texturing because I deemed them one of the most essential tasks. Had to make sure each frame looked authentic and to give the viewer the sense they were really in a real gallery. I created my own smart materials for the frames to speed up this process. Week 5. This week was dedicated to creating a block-out gallery and the exploding animated video in order to showcase the project's varying features. This week was also dedicated to finishing my screencast and presentation. Finally, week 6. This was the week in which I finalised and collated all the work ready for the hand-in. This next video clip shows a tutorial on how replica antique frames were made, and it provided me with the information I needed in order to create each piece of the frame correctly and accurately.
Once each side is contoured, the ends are cut at a 45-degree angle. Then a slot is cut into each one. Glue is put in the slot. Then a piece of wood called a biscuit goes in. The piece of biscuit that sticks out will fit into the glued slot of the adjoining frame piece. Then he cuts a piece of gold leaf, a sheet of pure gold, a mere 1/10,000th of a millimetre thick. He applies it with a fine brush made of squirrel hair, which he's lightly oiled. As soon as he taps the frame, the water in the gilder's liquor pulls the gold leaf away from the oil that has made it stick to the bristles. Too much oil on the brush or too little water in the gilder's liquor can hinder this delicate transfer. Next, the master gilder rubs select areas with a polished agate stone. This burnishing process compresses the gold leaf, making it smooth and shiny.
Modelling for VR is slightly different, so the use of mid-poly modelling is essential due to the fact baking normal maps can look unrealistic up close. So I began by modelling in low poly and then beveling all the edges around one side of each frame. Due to a lot of the detail being in the textures, this kept my poly count low, so that I would not run into any issues further down the line. Using the research video's information, this paved the way for using the biscuits in order to boolean into the frame to piece each frame section together. We had a limited amount of time, and ensuring that I had a clear plan was essential. Due to the nature of the frames, I was able to mirror each side of the frame and copy the UVs over in order to save myself precious time in the development stages. On this particular frame, I did add some extra sculpting to the design. Creating this brush in ZBrush allowed me to replicate it over and over to be placed on the frame. I did have an initial issue with the poly count, but after importing the brush into Blender, I was able to decimate it right down, without affecting the detail or the silhouette. I did unwrap them separately, so they could also be viewed as individual pieces on the frame. This only helped the designs of the frames, as this added extra moving parts to the design for the viewer to look at and examine. During the development of the textures in each frame, I was able to speed up the process by creating smart materials from the gold leaf texture and the wood textures I had created on the first frame. This really helped with the texturing process and allowed me to ensure that I was on track with the project. Although finding high resolution images of each painting did prove to be more difficult than expected. The use of alphas was a crucial part of the texturing process. Using the reference I had already collated allowed me to replicate patterns easily to be used as alphas within the textures. This was very successful, as it helped to keep the authenticity that I was aiming for within the project. If I was to continue to develop this project or replicate it, I would have taken on some slightly more challenging frames and tried to sculpt some extra details in the frames, so there would be more for the viewer to explore in VR. Steps for a future version of this project would be to add some info boards next to each frame to give the viewer some historical information about what they were looking at. This is the end of the presentation, and thank you for watching.